Hey everyone, and welcome back to GameDive, the gaming conversation show where we discuss one game each episode and give our thoughts and opinions. I'm Perry, and joining me for today's romp is Cam
G'day.
and Evan.
Hey.
And for today's episode, in honor of the recently released Last of Us Part 2, we're talking about the PlayStation exclusive by Naughty Dog, the hit sensation, The Last of Us Part 1, which I think we have to call it Part 1 now because Part 2 just came out, so the world will never be the same.
Not an official title. I refuse.
Evan, why don't you give us a little rundown on The Last of Us?
All right, so The Last of Us is a narrative-driven horror third-person survival shooter, which follows Joel, a smuggler and a father, through a world devastated by a sudden and unprecedented infection. In the rebuilt dystopia following the initial infection, you're tasked to smuggle a young girl, Ellie, to a headquarters of an anti-government militia called the Fireflies. You'll later discover this is due to Ellie holding a possible immunization against the mutated cordyceps fungus. Throughout the game, Joel and Ellie will face the kindest as well as the worst that humanity has to offer, while always the threat of the infected will loom over their heads. And this is what you're going to be dealing with throughout all combat encounters and all interactions in the game.
Absolutely. And so, Cam, as I understand, you just played through this game all the way through for the first time. So why don't you kind of start us off with your, I guess, first impressions?
Sure. So, first off, I think I got to thank the podcast for actually getting me back to this game. So, I'll preface this with saying that I did try to play this game before, maybe like 6-7 months ago. And I got a couple hours in, and I honestly thought the game sucked. It was not going well for me. I thought that the story was really boring. I thought the characters were kind of dull and kind of just, I don't know, bumbling around a little bit. The gameplay wasn't anything special. I'd been recently going through the Uncharted series as well, so it just kind of felt like, it almost felt like a side game. It felt like the Halo ODST to the Halo 3, just kind of like they changed it a bit, but it's the same game. It doesn't really feel any different. But honestly, I'm like way back the time I just played through most recently. I'm very happy that I did because honestly, I don't know. It put it in a new light for me. I don't know exactly what changed. Maybe it was a better mood, but it allowed me to actually see the character development and kind of get into the game a little bit more. And one of the biggest changes I made was turning it off of survival difficulty down to hard, because on survival difficulty it doesn't really allow you to even use half the functions of the actual game. So I think
Right.
whereas most games you can kind of like the Uncharted series is kind of what I was expecting to. Like I jump into brutal and just play through brutal for the first time just because I'm used to that. But for this game, it really changes the game in more than just a difficulty standpoint, and it kind of almost feels like it removes portions of the game.
It definitely strikes me as odd that they would allow you to pick this highest difficulty right off the bat. And I mean, it's the same guys who made Uncharted, and they let you pick, brutal right off the bat too. So
Yeah, well, the difference being that you can play on brutal and it's a lot harder. Like, don't get me wrong, it's a lot harder than the other difficulties. But the difference is that you still experience the game and what it has to offer. The difference with survival difficulty in The Last of Us is it literally lowers the amount of crafting supplies, materials, and things you need to get upgrades, pills, and the gun upgrade materials. So by the time it tells you that these systems exist, it's like I've never seen any of these things. They just don't exist in the world. So it literally removes parts of the game. So that to me is like the worst kind of difficulty. It's not making things necessarily more difficult. It's making them more difficult. Don't get me wrong, but it's doing so by removing parts of the game. So it's making it more difficult, but it's also removing things that keep the game interesting and what makes the game a whole.
Yeah, I'm definitely one to promote the idea that increase, a good way to increase difficulty is, increase realism. And it seems like that's what they've done here, where, it's Survivor. In real life, you're not stumbling over cans of things and nails and fabrics that you can just rip apart and turn into a gun sight or something. It seems like they've taken the idea of actual survival and, made it as almost true to how difficult and unforgiving that would be. So it's like they could have just done the typical increased damage and leave everything else the same, or there was other ways they could have done it, and I think that making the survival itself more difficult is probably the best way they could have in the case of this game in particular. But you're right, it is frustrating that due to that, you lose some of the game systems that are more, fantastical.
Well, survival games like this always seem to struggle with something where you're straddling the line between giving the player enough resources that they can make it through the game, but not enough that they're just like throwing out resources willy nilly. And like obviously in post-apocalyptic scenario, you want to be efficient, right? You want to be efficient with whatever you're given.
Yeah, so that's the problem. Do you want to be fun or do you want to be real?
Yeah, and there's a difficult balancing act, like you're saying, in how they have to balance between how much supplies they give the player and how much they'll need realistically.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that this game, more so than most AAA titles at least, really doubles down on the kind of scarcity of materials and ammo that you can find. By comparison to something like Fallout is a good one to look at. At the start of Fallout, you really don't have a lot of ammo. You have to scrounge for whatever you can find, but it's not long before you're sitting on like hundreds of bullets. Several thousand caps, like money. And same with Bioshock. You start off with not a lot of ammo and go through much the same beats. So what I'm trying to say is, I think it's pretty commendable that this game commits so much to the scarcity of really making it tough.
I think we actually talked about that during the Bioshock discussion, where I mentioned that a lot of the time survival horror games tend to drop that for a power fantasy near the end, which was the case for Bioshock, where you're no longer worried necessarily about ammo, or you've just become spraying a person who's able to spray bullets and not necessarily worry about that aspect of the game. Whereas this, it feels like they did stay true to that, where if you're conservative with how you're approaching different combat scenarios, then you could end up with safe sort of supply of ammunition and tools. But if you're not, then the game isn't going to forgive you later and tell you you're way more powerful now. You have a pocket twice as deep that can hold twice as many bullets. It's as scarce as it was from the beginning.
Somewhat. There is a bit of this power fantasy that you described, but you're right. It's definitely much more subtle, or I guess not as in your face. Like, you
Sure.
upgrade your weapons to have a larger
Yeah.
mag, and probably by the end you will have a more generous pile of ammo than in the first half of the game. But it's still, you can't just go in guns blazing, which
Yeah, no, I found with
even by
my playthrough that that wasn't the case. Or maybe it's because I didn't approach these interactions very efficiently. But
yeah.
I never felt comfortable with the amount of ammo or that I had, and I always found myself scrounging throughout the game, even by the end, and trying to figure out which gun I should use and how that will leave me in terms of ammunition by the end of the encounter.
It definitely felt like ammo was a luxury in this game. Part of it being that, especially if all you have is handgun ammo, so say a revolver or the 9mm or whatever the pistol is, those guns are very difficult to actually kill zombies with. I
Yeah.
mean, they're much more effective on humans because humans will generally pop out and try to shoot you, and they'll keep their head pretty exposed. But it's really difficult
Yeah.
to score headshots on the actual zombies. So you kind of divide your weapons between human killing weapons and like weapons that you'll use on clickers. So like obviously the shotguns and the shotgun pistol. Um, where I kind of agree that I like that they made it feel like I was always scrounging for ammo, and if I was like use too many bullets in one encounter, I would restart because, well, like I need those things.
Now, is this survivor difficulty that this would happen, or hard?
Survivor.
Yeah.
For context, I think I switched down off of Survivor around when Sam and Henry came into the game, so a decent portion of the way through.
Pretty good. Yeah, it's a pretty good way.
Yeah, decent portion of the way through. And which kind of perfectly leads into what I want to talk about is if you really want to conserve your stuff, this game turns into like one of the most boring creep around stealth strangler games of all time.
Which is unfortunately what survival would likely be.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
exactly, right? But in terms of does it service the gameplay? No, it really doesn't. It's really not much fun creeping around the environments and like just strangling people off and hoping that like you don't get seen by other things because it's kind of frustrating when you have to restart.
Tom Clancy's The Last of Us. For
Yeah.
someone going in expecting there to be a lot of exciting set piece action, if you're running into constantly just being sort of driven into avoiding confrontation more than anything until you have no other choice, then it could probably be a bit disappointing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good bit of narrative theming and tie-in, as you say, that stealth is kind of your primary way of engaging until you have no other choice, which I think fits really nicely in the world and the narrative. In that, you would only fight head on one, as a last resort, like
Yeah.
if that was your only choice in this scenario.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to say I'm a fairly patient person when it comes to a lot of things, so I don't often have a problem with waiting in game or taking a long time to get from point A to point B if that's what the goal is. And
Unless we're talking about Shadow of the Colossus.
Fucking got him.
unless we're talking about bad games.
Oh,
Oh shoot. Uh-oh.
easy now.
We
But,
gotta cut this early, I think.
Yeah,
but
fucking show up at your house, shoot your damn block up.
I mean, there's a portion in the game where I can't remember when exactly it took place through my playthrough, but it was after, as Joel, you are separated from Ellie because you fall through a floor into sort of a basement level of a building, and you end up in this room, sort of double wide, with two entrances on either side to a hallway. On the other side of the hallway, there's two rooms cut off in the middle with a door between them, and it's full of spores and infected. There's probably about 3 clickers, and I want to say there was a bloater. But when that happened to me, I likely spent an hour down there just sitting. I mean, most of the time sitting in that main first room, figuring out, tracking the movements of the clickers, trying to figure out the patterns, trying to figure out when the optimal time to move was. It just as much as possible to avoid confrontation, because it's this game does a really good job, I think, in terms of creating very threatening enemies in terms of the infected,
Absolutely.
especially the clickers. Those things are terrifying. So
Well, yeah, they'll kill you in one hit if they touch you.
Yeah,
yeah,
unless you upgrade the shiv.
so it's for me, I am perfectly okay sitting there sneaking around and hugging things to death, as opposed to taking a second, running out, hoping I don't get seen. If I do, fight my way out. So it definitely lends itself to certain types of people when it comes to how they choose to approach these situations.
I suppose. So I'll say that I actually really like the clicker. I think it's a really cool enemy type, right? They're so far gone that like their eyes don't work and they can only really detect you through sound, through their hearing. The only problem I do have is when there's anything more than just clickers and there's like the regular infected that can just see you and run at you. It feels like it ruins everything. Because like I'd like to move around an environment and just like move around the clickers. I think that'd be totally fine. You have to be quiet and like you have to be cognizant. If there's things on the ground and you make a noise by stepping on like a tree branch or something, they'll come after you. And that's cool. I like that. The problem is when you're trying to stealth around guys that aren't blind and they just like kind of see you out of the corner of your eye and then freak out and run at you and you just like lose the entire encounter because of that. It's not really fun. It's just frustrating.
Yeah, I would agree about the runners that they sometimes force you into situations that seem almost unstealthable, and that might be by design even, because there's definitely quite a handful of situations where they force you to fight. So it
Yeah,
could be
definitely.
that that's what they're there for, is to force you into fight.
There's definitely moments where you're able to get rid of the horde that's seen you, the regular runners, and without having to engage with the clickers, as long as you're able to keep your distance for a lot of the time, you can hide again. You can re-enable the whole stealth loop, and then deal with the clickers more safe and a bit easier in that way. Like I remember there was a bit when you're running through, I want to say a tunnel, and there's a bunch of cars spread about the place, and there's a bunch of clickers every so often, but there's also a bunch of the regular infected as well. And so, as soon as you get in there, the regular infected come after you. But what I found myself doing is trying to run away, deal with those ones, and then reestablish my stealth.
Yeah, but that to me doesn't feel like intended gameplay. That to me feels like an exploitation. Like you just try to like you aggro some guys and you run away far enough that you can kill the guys that are after you and then de-aggro the rest of them, and then you come back to it. It feels like an exploitation to me. It doesn't feel like gameplay.
Oh, but in the
Well,
case
it
where
seems a
there's a
big on the
blind,
gamier side, certainly.
that's true. But in the case of a blind enemy type, getting out of their field of hearing is something you would do anyways, wouldn't it?
I mean, I suppose,
Yeah, it
but I
definitely
mean,
makes sense.
when they just de-aggro, like if they hear a gunshot, like they should like just come
Go
after you
nuts,
until they
yeah.
find like, they go crazy. I think the problem is like once they do hear you, they just kind of act like a runner that like takes a little more to be put down and like you can't melee, right? They don't really turn into anything different. Where if they were like slower and you could like maneuver around the area, like while dealing with the runners while they were kind of like hot on your tail, but like
Mm.
you could still move away from them. I think that would be a way better system of doing it. And then through that means if you were to de-aggro them through actually moving through the environment, not just moving to a point in the map where they de-aggro, I think it'd be a much more valid way of progressing through the areas.
That's a good point. But would it make them less threatening if they weren't as quick to come after you?
I mean, I suppose so, but the thing is, like, they're not so quick already that you can't get away from them.
Yeah.
They're at the same speed as runners, and you can kind of get away from runners as it is. It's
Mhm.
just they don't feel. I don't know. They just feel like an annoying runner. I guess they don't feel different enough, even though they have this really cool, like, story integrated gameplay loop.
Yeah, I mean they're more advanced runners, right? It's like
Mhm.
that's what the runners are going to become given more time.
Yeah, well, they definitely are an interesting enemy in that in stealth situations they can't be killed like easily. Like during stealth, quite often it's better to just avoid the clickers altogether because you don't want to waste a shiv.
Yeah, those are
Yeah.
expensive.
Which is a good way of making them like more threatening, like a bigger obstacle for you to have to work around because you can't shiv every clicker in the game, as far as I know.
Yeah. Well, it incentivizes you to like if you have to go through one, you can brute force your way through it, but obviously you want to go around them. It's just frustrating that the game is it makes it so frustrating in some of the early, especially the early encounters when you first encounter the clickers. It just makes it very difficult to actually get through the runners without setting off the clickers.
That's true, but we also have to remember who started on survival difficulty early on in the game. Now, I will say
Well,
that I played through hard for the whole thing, and you're right. I mean, at the beginning, it is quite difficult. I remember when you first get out with Ellie and Tess, and you're in the broken down downtown core, and you're jumping through sort of skyscrapers that have fallen apart or begin falling apart. There's one point where you have to get around a bunch of regular runners, and there's one or two clickers in there as well. And that likely took me an hour just to get through
I think
that
I know the part
section.
you're talking about. It's like raining at the time.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's like the first time. Yeah, it's the first time you encounter clickers and runners in the same
yeah.
room.
And it's super frustrating for
I
sure.
remember
But
it very specifically because I had questioned myself like what is the gameplay supposed to look like at this point? Like I can't stealth through the runners and I don't have any ammo, so I can't kill the clickers. Like what like so I ended up just doing this really frustrating, like try not even to spook the runner kind of stealth playthrough through that area. And it didn't work. Oh, so yeah, again, survival difficulty. If you add some more ammo, you get some more options.
yeah.
But survival difficulty again goes to what I'm saying. It literally made that area like almost unplayable.
So what we're saying is we probably wouldn't survive a fungus apocalypse ourselves.
Absolutely not.
Dude, we're hardly surviving COVID, so
This is true.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, there are some interesting parallels in the game to our current situation.
Especially the political parallels, funnily enough.
Anyway, to talk about The Last of Us for a sec. It is interesting, or maybe interesting is the wrong word, but definitely some of the combat situations with the zombies, at least early on, will kind of devolve into a button mash almost. Like I find myself in like a brawl, with 3 or 4 zombies that don't have any weapons or anything.
Oh,
So you're
yeah.
just punching, and it's kind of like, well, this doesn't make sense. I would be overwhelmed by three or
Put your
four
paws up,
zombies in a
boy.
fist fight. Yeah.
Sounds like D&D might have written this intro segment, but
We forgot
yeah,
that
now there's
zombies are supposed to be terrifying.
yeah, it's definitely surprisingly lenient when you start getting overwhelmed. Like you will likely die after a certain point, but it gives you a more than fair chance to get away from the situation.
Well, especially if you have like some followers, right? If you have Sam
Yeah.
and Henry with you, like
Oh,
they'll
yeah.
aggro zombies, then you can literally just beat the crap out of them with your hands.
Well, and on that note, it's nice that the followers are actually a part of the combat, and they actually do interact with the enemies in a
Mhm.
way that makes sense and makes it feel more real. As you don't just turn around and see like Ellie and Bill hiding behind a shed while fight 3 clickers with a wooden plank.
Yeah. Alternatively, they're not invincible either, right? Like they can get caught up with a zombie, and then they kind of fight for their life until you
And they
save them,
scream
right?
for help. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's interesting how a Naughty Dog chose to deal with the companion character, I think, in this game, where, there's games where the companion character is entirely they're just there. They follow around. Nothing interacts with them, and they don't interact with anything. It feels like almost definitely the worst kind. And then there's others where it's, say, God of War, where you, in a way, control a sort of portion of your companion character, or you're using them in combat, you're giving them prompts. So it's almost an extension of your character, as well as them having their own thing. And this Naughty Dog feels like it's in the middle, where they've been created to be their own independent AI, basically. And they're not just going to sit there and let things happen, but they're not going to take your controls into consideration. They're going to do their own thing.
Yeah, I really like that about it. I like that there isn't like a squad command button, like hit left on the D-pad to get Ellie to shoot it, like shoot a clicker or whatever. Because that would feel like very gamey,
Yeah.
and I would definitely hurt the immersion, I guess here.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really nice when you're in combat situations and you get sort of a contextual thing happen with you fighting something, and one of your companions will come up and assist you in some way. I'm not sure if you guys have had any like major interactions in terms of that, but it's definitely one of the most memorable parts of the combat.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Like, there's some nice like contextual interactions, like you're talking about, and like things like when you melee finish an enemy like next to a wall, Joel will usually slam their head into the wall, like with that context of the wall being there.
Yeah.
Or I found out just recently you can be grappled by zombies against a wall, and then like Ellie will come up and stab them in the back to save you, which is like purely just like a contextual thing that you could probably play the whole game and miss. Just like a lot of nice little touches like that.
You want to talk about late game power fantasy? When you have to play as Ellie and you can like murder people with the knife instead of having to choke them out, that is the late game power fantasy.
A knife that doesn't break.
Yeah.
What technology is this?
Naughty Dog looked at that section and said, "What if we made a whole game out of this?"
Well, it will definitely be interesting to see what The Last of Us Part 2 does with the gameplay. Like if they evolve it in some way or
I
make it
know.
less gamey or what they'll decide to do with it.
Well, I know at the very least, through looking at their sort of pre-release stuff, promotional things, and them talking about how they went about designing the sequel, that they in The Last of Us Part 1, Joel feels heavy. This is an older middle-aged guy. He's not as flexible and nimble as he used to be. Yeah. So a lot of the time there's things where it's like it did feel a bit gamey, or you feel like you can jump over that, but you just can't, which is probably just limitations in the design. But in the sequel, I know they said that they've made Ellie more nimble. She has a dedicated jump button now, so everything's going to be a lot more vertical, and it really lends itself. You're playing a young woman. She's not all about brute force, and she's a bit more sly when it comes to combat encounters, and she's able to outmaneuver a lot of enemies, and that's her direction in terms of that, as opposed to how Joel used to be. So I think that's an interesting evolution in terms of that.
Oh, I hope they take that and I hope they run with it properly. Because I hope they, again, it doesn't end up into like a stealth simulator, but if you can actually mold that into an actual interactive gameplay with the rest of the characters in the game, I think that'd be absolutely a worthwhile inclusion.
Yeah.
Well, I want to talk about, I mean, this game, we haven't really said it so far, but the gameplay is actually quite simple by comparison to a lot of AAA titles. Like the gameplay loops are pretty, maybe not repetitive, but definitely
Shallow.
simple. Like, yeah, shallow. And not that that's inherently a bad thing. It, I think, serves this game so well simply because the narrative is so strong and such a big focus that the immersion is really, I think, what they were going for the most. And that being said, there are some kind of cookie cutter like elements to this game, like crafting items and upgrading weapons and your player skills. Um, you know, they're not not exactly groundbreaking stuff. It's all like very basic, like progression, I guess, to make you feel like you're getting a little stronger, like you have a little better shot in the next fight.
Yeah, you're definitely right. I mean, those at this point are definitely video game tropes, honestly. The crafting, survival, all that, yeah, and like perks and things like that. But I feel like those started more or less with survival games, where it is an enjoyable aspect of the survival loop. Like when people play a survival game, they want to feel like they're crafting things out of salvage and scavenging bits to progress themselves. So it seems almost more like in that regard, an unfortunate
Side effect of this being a video game.
an unfortunate side effect of the time that it was made, that these mechanics had become so widespread at this point and still continue to be. So for a stealth game, I think that they're a good addition. Or sorry, not a stealth, a survival game. I think they're a good addition, but you wonder if they could have done more with it.
I think some of it's a little misguided, especially some of the weapon upgrades, right? Like there's weapon upgrades for like reload times on things. Like, dude, if I have to reload, I'm done. I'm dead here. Like it's not like a kind of thing, or like the fire rate with certain guns. I mean, on some things it's useful. Most of the only things that are useful is like clip size and well, fire rate can be useful, but like most of the time it doesn't feel like, especially the gun upgrades, most of them don't feel like they actually do anything. Because honestly, it's like if you hit the headshot, you kill the guy. If you don't hit the headshot, well, why even bother shooting a bullet, right?
Well, it feels like these are upgrades that are taken from, other shooter games where it's, you want fire rate and you want reload speed. So, you can put more rounds down range, as they say. And, in this game, you don't have a lot of bullets. So I look at an upgrade like fire rate, like this is just an excuse for me to waste more ammo. Like, I don't want to do that.
That's a
Well, I
good
mean,
point,
in
actually.
Uncharted, those would be great upgrades, to be honest.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're almost like the expected upgrades for a shooter.
They just don't work in this instance, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, an upgrade that would actually be useful is like holster time or like redraw time
Yeah,
or something like
absolutely.
that.
It's the same thing with the medication, like the upgrades there. It's like listening and health; those are good, but like crafting speed, the hell am I ever like crafting stuff
Yeah.
right in a zombie's face? Like that's not.
Well, it's
It
funny.
doesn't happen.
Even in Naughty Dog's promotional stuff for Last of Us 2, it's like they have this fantasy of the player being, right next to a goon somewhere and suddenly thinking, what'd be perfect right about now? A nail grenade. And they open their bag, everything's still going on. They quickly like bang, bang, bang. Suddenly they get their tool that they wanted and sets off the encounter. Or it's like I feel like most players aren't playing like that.
No, I think I used a nail grenade like maybe once the
Yeah, or
entire
even
game.
just crafting mid encounter.
Yeah, exactly. I can see what they want. You want it to feel more frantic. Like, okay, Ellie's getting grappled by a zombie. I'm gonna run behind this car, build a Molotov real quick. But
Yeah.
Burn them both.
yeah, but
Burn!
it doesn't ever work out that way.
Yeah.
You don't have the
Again,
time.
so remember what I was saying about if the clickers were slower? If the clickers would ever to like box you in or something like that, and you had to like craft something quickly in order to escape the situation, that would be a perfectly valid time to do that. But like that's not how the game works. So there's no looming threat. They just kind of wander around and find you, right?
Yeah, so I think it's like you said, like misguided a bit in some of those ways.
I mean, it's not like it's the first time we've seen this from Naughty Dog. Remember in Uncharted 1 when they thought that people were going to be stealth killing any enemies except for the one that they blatantly give us? They just didn't quite understand exactly how the game was going to be played.
We would have hoped they had learned in the time between the two.
Well, they learned by the second game. Naughty Dog, I like Naughty Dog. I think they're a decent developer.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I think in terms of Uncharted, they definitely progressed exponentially from the first game to the second game. So I really hope that they take, what worked and what didn't work from this game and really mold The Last of Us 2 to, actually deserve all the 10 out of 10s it's getting.
Actually, one thing I will say is thinking about that now and replaying it recently is it did not feel like a game from 2013. I've been playing the remaster, so obviously graphically it's a lot better than the original, but
Well, can I just cut in real quick and just tell you that the remaster for the PS4 came out 1 year after the initial launch date for this game. So a
okay,
remaster is a
well,
bit of a
point stands even more so then. So, remasters basically made at the same point. So, in terms of the game systems and everything that you're doing in the game, to me, it doesn't feel like a game that came out then. It feels like a game that's come out in the last, 4 years, 3 years, which either goes to show how little games have progressed in that time or how ahead of its time this game was in terms of just how solid everything was, not necessarily how deep the mechanics themselves were.
I think it's the first one there. I honestly like the game is in a way just a reskinned Uncharted. So I think it's more just some games get by without doing anything special. So I think like while this game does have like a decently thought out menu system and stuff like that, I think it's more that some games just don't push the envelope and don't explore anything. That's why this game might have felt, not so dated to you.
Also, probably because this game is definitely more of a narrative and theme focused game and less of a gameplay
Yeah.
focused thing. So
Yeah,
in
it's not
terms of
more
that, the narrative and everything
mechanically
are
impressive.
the presentation and narrative are absolutely impressive, but gameplay is nothing that stands out.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because The Last of Us is not really a game that I would describe as being fun. Like that's not the word I would use necessarily, and but rather as like engaging, right? And I'm taking this right from the mouth of Neil Druckmann, which is the creative director for the first and second games. Um, and I think that's an important distinction because like the game it's so simple, it's not something that I would replay like every 6 months, but because of the narrative and the immersive qualities to it, it is very engaging and you want to see what's going to happen next and you want to get through each encounter.
Yeah, but again, like you say, it's not something you even with the story. Well, I'll talk about what I think about the story. But even with it being the way that it is, I don't think there's even any replay value there because you already kind of experienced that. I will say that the character development could be worth experiencing again. But like you say, like if you were to go back and like replay a chapter, like what chapter would you go replay? Is there any one that really sticks out to you as, oh, this chapter was so much fun to go and play?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the
Gives you the
replayability of the
knife,
game,
baby.
in terms of the replayability, I don't feel like it's necessary. Like, yeah, I agree. I don't think I would necessarily feel the drive to replay this game, but that's because I experienced it already. And if I ever were to, it's because I want to experience that full story again, not because I want to play a segment of it again, or because I really enjoyed this one encounter or this set of uh, encounters that happen at certain points. It's it told its story, and I say it told it fairly effectively, and it doesn't need to do it a second time.
Yeah, so exactly. It's not the kind of thing that you're replaying just for the gameplay, specifically just for the gameplay's sake, something like XCOM, for example. But I think it's important to note that's not a bad thing inherently, when talking about things like replay value and what that adds to a game. I think replay value is absolutely just something that is a bonus if it's there for a game, rather than being kind of a qualifying addition to a game. Like, and it wouldn't make a lot of sense for it to be in something like this, for there to be like a randomized loot pool or something to make it, different the second time you play. It's not something you need here.
It would be a branching narrative would be the only way you could do replayability in a narrative-driven game, really.
But I feel like that just those kind of things just generally dilute the quality of the narrative. I
Oh,
mean,
exactly.
games like
It's
Mass
less
Effect do a
focused.
really good job of it. But yeah, I like that when they choose a direct focus and they tell the story they're trying to tell instead of like, oh, you decide. I think that's like kind of a cop out in some ways.
That's actually a good point, and I guess something that I guess appreciated about this game, but didn't really realize it about till now, is that there isn't any of these choices that so many narrative games have nowadays. Like, feel like they need to have. It's definitely quite the trope these days that player choice is above all the most important thing. But it is nice that this game is kind of just taking you along for the ride, almost,
Well, yeah.
like a film.
Yeah, one of the most promising aspects of video games as a medium is allowing the player to connect with the character they're playing as more so than through film. So by that logic, having a structured, solid, in stone narrative is at its core, as long as it's good in the first place, as good as a movie, and being able to play through it and experience what this character is experiencing only elevates it further. So in that regard, having a game that you are just following a set out story, it's not based on your own personal inputs or decisions, it only elevates your attachment to that story.
I'd say it can. I think this game does a pretty good job of it. But if you, for instance, kind of like the pacing's off and then it locks pacing behind tedious tasks and things like
Yeah.
that, I think that can definitely abruptly affect the storytelling. But I think in
I
this
mean,
game they
like, I
don't.
don't connect to Tetris as much as I do this in terms of that block falling. But you're right. Yeah, the narrative does have to be good as the starting point.
Well, it has to be paced. What I'm trying to say is that you can have a great story, but if you only get like 5 minutes of story for every like 30 minutes of grinding and tedium, like the game's not going to be good, right?
Like Shadow of the Colossus.
You have to have your yin and your yang. Well, I mean, Shadow of the Colossus. I mean, you know what? I'm not even going to
Had
get into
about
this with you right
5
now.
minutes of story throughout the game.
Leave me alone.
Well, it's interesting how this game bringing you along a set path actually, by doing it that way, they're able to make you feel differently about the way you're experiencing it. And the best way they do that in this game is by having Joel do things that you wouldn't do. And you're kind of embodying him. And I think the most interesting way they do that is right at the end. Um, spoilers for The Last of Us if you got this far, but when you're fighting through the Firefly lab, murdering them to save Ellie's life, it's kind of repulsive. But if you want to finish the game, it's what you have to do. And in that moment, you're you're forced to align with Joel,
Yeah.
which is
And then he doubles down at the end and lies to Ellie about what happened at
Yeah.
the Firefly place, even though she explicitly says, like, I don't know, like, did you tell the full truth? Like, what really happened? Do you promise that what you told me is what actually happened? And Joel doubles down and says yes.
I mean, that's the thing, though. He isn't a perfect character. He's flawed. He spent the first 2/3 of the game in denial about his own daughter's death. And by the time he comes to terms with that and accepts Ellie as this daughter figure in his eyes, he can't let go of her. And presumably throughout the course of the game, you as the player get to a similar relationship with Ellie as a character, where you're attached to her as well. So in this case, you guys either feel that what he's doing is wrong and for the greater good, he should have given up Ellie despite the cost to himself, which it is a selfish decision at the end because she was okay with saving the world, basically. But at the same time, as a player who's spent how many ever hours getting through this game and building up this relationship with these characters, you might not want to give up Ellie either. It's like you are in that father role where you've helped her this far and you guys have gotten closer, and accepting allowing this child to die for the greater good is a crazy just decision.
Moral proposition.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, my experience too, it wasn't abundantly clear to me that Ellie was aware that she wouldn't survive the treatment.
Yeah.
It seems like they just said, you're going under surgery, we're putting you under. Like,
Yeah.
to me, it didn't seem like Ellie was even aware of the choice, or not, well, the lack of choice she had, but that, like, in order to save the human population from this virus, she would have to die.
Who's greater, this one person or the human race? And
Yeah,
it's
an interesting question.
more
Certainly.
complex than you might think it is.
Yeah, and I wasn't by any means saying that necessarily every player would disagree with Joel's actions in that moment, but
for sure.
I can just as easily imagine this game coming out, you get to the end, and then, a button prompt comes up on screen, and it's like, press X to save Ellie, press V to leave forever. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
The
yeah.
they
weakest
give,
choose your adventure of all time.
yeah, like I feel like that is something they easily could have done, but I think it enriches the experience a lot in that they don't let you choose that. They give you this ending that is kind of, well, yeah, you may not agree with it, and that's how the story goes. It's the way the
Yeah,
cookie crumbles.
you aren't Joel. You're experiencing Joel's story, and this is what Joel chooses, not you.
Yeah, and I mean, to talk about the story and the writing, I think one of the things that has made this game so popular and so successful is actually the quality of the writing. I personally feel like this is like film tier writing. It's something I could see this happening in a movie, like this exact plot playing out, and I absolutely mean that in a good way. Like, it's even some of the most high budget narrative games of recent times, like Red Dead Redemption 2 or God of War 2018, which have high quality narratives. Don't get me wrong; they still feel kind of fantastical or video gamey in a way. But this game is very
The
grounded,
game based on mythology? No way.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah, it tells a more brutally real story than a lot of other games would. There's a lot of loss involved. There's a lot of, heavier emotion involved than just the feel good adventure. Even if some games do have their own emotional turmoil involved in their narrative, this one doesn't shy away from it at all. I mean, almost everyone you encounter dies at some point.
And some of them, it really hit you in the gut with the way that they do die, especially the time, like when Sam gets infected and then,
Yeah, I mean,
he's attacking Ellie, and then like Joel's gonna go kill Sam, and then Henry says, "Don't you fucking dare do it!" Right, and then he ends up killing Sam, and then like can't handle the loss. It's like he was living to pull his brother through, and then kills himself. That's a heavy
too
moment.
real. Yeah. And I feel like a lot of games would shy away from that.
Yeah, and it has a lot of these like deeply human moments, like the ones you're just describing there, or having to leave Tess behind, and she's saying this is her last stop. She's not going any further, and like, if we ever had anything, you and I, like, you'll do this last thing and take Ellie, across the country, and yeah, it's something we can connect with because it feels so grounded.
Well, I'd like to say that I think that's because of how good the characters are written, voiced, and acted out throughout the story. I want to kind of start off this topic by saying I don't actually think the narrative in the game is very good. I think it's very like typical, like other than like, the zombies slightly different. It's fungal based and it takes over people's brains, and that's how that works. I don't think like it seems like standard zombie plot. What's really special to me in this game is the characters and the way the characters develop and how much fun and how heartbreaking it can be to see the characters act in such like a human manner. That's like not captured almost ever in video games.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that in terms of the overarching narrative beats, it's Hollywood, dystopian society, enemy militia taking down the overbearing government forces. There's a cure. You have to get her from point A to point B. The cure ends up being too much of a cost, so you leave. Put it that way, it doesn't stand out all that much, but
It's really nothing special.
yeah, but the thing that makes the game special is the characters and
It's the little
the
bits, the
yeah,
bits in
it's
between.
the strength of a video game, and having 30 hours with these characters is you get to get close to them, and you get to see those little moments that would be skipped over in terms of pacing in a movie or TV show. This is what elevates this story, because it's not about the overarching stuff. The overarching stuff is just a means to tell this character story. It's about Joel and Ellie's growth over this adventure, and that's what makes it a compelling story.
Yeah, it's an unremarkable backdrop, but yeah, the story is not based on spectacle, like something like, the World War Z movie where there's like a tower of zombies climbing a wall, and like that's what makes it interesting.
And a
No,
plane
it's
crash.
based,
Yeah.
yeah, but it's based on the emotion and the human connection. That it's not even it was never about the zombies.
No, it's certain moments like where Joel constantly avoids talking about his daughter. And then when his brother Tommy like offers him a photo of him and his daughter, he like refuses it because he's continually trying to put it into his past. And whenever Ellie tries to bring that up, he shuts it down almost immediately. And not quite threatens her, but is very forceful in saying like, "Drop this. I will refuse to talk about this." And then by the end, you can see the development where I can't remember exactly what Joel says, but he accepts the picture that Tommy once tried to give to him from Ellie and says, maybe it's not worth trying to forget that this happened, but it's the journey of trying to move forward. And it's character development moments like that that really make it just so special in this game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people say that the best science fiction, as an example, isn't about fantastical, otherworldly things. The best science fiction tells a very human story. And I think that's what this game does. It takes this science fiction, fantastic element and uses it to drive this character moment of a father who's come to terms with his daughter's death and accepting this new girl as a friend.
It's almost like a redemption story as a father. It's kind of an interesting story method that we haven't really seen too often, right? Where there's a loss, and then instead of just kind of going crazy because of your loss, you kind of hide yourself away for so long, and then when you're given a chance at redemption, you kind of course you shy away from it because it's ugly and it's hard to deal with this woman that reminds you so much of the daughter that you lost, and having to take care of this, and you have all these paternal instincts come over you again. It's not something that I really recognize too many in other things.
I'd like to mention God of War, which, now that you're saying this, hits almost every beat except switch daughter with wife.
Yeah, true, but again, it's not.
It's not a
in that game. It's
common.
more Kratos has sort of like any family he ever knew, he killed himself, and like the story of betrayal and control from the gods, right? And then having a son, and him having like no idea to how to even interact with just regular people or other, well, I guess not regular people in this case, gods and whatever, just socially interact, let alone raise your own offspring.
Yeah, no, he's an awkward murderous demigod, but
Yeah, they have similar story beats, but I think this one is a little more grounded because you're not punching guys through rock walls in this one.
but same idea, that the surrounding fantastic elements are telling a grounded story about a father and his son, right?
It is interesting how this game explores moving on from loss, where so much of mainstream media and AAA titles are quite often about revenge. Like if you look at, I don't know, God of War 2005, where you must exact revenge for your murdered family. Um, obviously different stories, different times, but I definitely appreciate that they tell, I guess, a much softer story here.
It's a more human story. It's not just you become like it's so often the writing kind of divulges into, oh, this character is consumed by revenge. It's all they become. And like that's not even what Joel was about. It wasn't like he was looking for revenge or whatever thing. He's just so like consumed by the grief of his loss that, he did some reprehensible things, right? Like he was a looter, he's been looted, he's done some things that he doesn't even want to talk to Ellie about because they're so ugly.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like from the sounds of things that the sequel is exploring that, the just being
Yeah.
consumed by hatred. So it'll be curious to see how they deal with that, and in terms of Ellie not being as mature as Joel was in this game and being able to move away from that, even if he does the arguably wrong thing at the end. It'll be curious to see how a younger character deals with all these heavy emotions of hate and loss.
I actually thought that the way that the even younger Ellie that we saw in this game, the way that she kind of dealt with like what's going on and like the fucked up world around her was very believable. I find that a lot of the time they write kids to be super one dimensional, and Ellie showed like a breathtaking amount of emotion throughout the story.
For sure. I mean, there's one scene in particular that always stands out to me, and I feel like a lot of people actually think of this when it comes to Ellie as a character, and it's when you're in a gymnasium, and I think it's the gym, but it's getting a bit foggy on me now. But throughout the game, there's a ladder you can't reach. You hit a button, and you tell Ellie, "Hey, get up there. I need this ladder," and she goes and she gets it, and you move on. That this is the full interaction, and this has been happening for a significant amount of time over the game at this point, and you get to this point where you can't progress because there's a ladder you need, and you hit that prompt and you say, "Hey Ellie, can you grab that for me?" And nothing happens. And then he's Ellie, and you turn around and she's sitting there like she's lost in thought because of what had just happened. And that felt real. This it's a kid, and she's been through awful things and unthinkable things. And you can't, in real life, they don't just bounce back and fetch ladders constantly with a smile on their face. She's struggling, and this creates a moment where you go over and you start talking to her, and see, it creates this deep character moment. And I think that is an amazing example of the depth of Ellie as a character in this game, where she absolutely isn't an afterthought to the main character.
Well, I think the moment you're referring to is when they get to it's Salt Lake City, right, where the game ends, and you can practically see the hospital from where you've walked to from the highway, and she's really considering like, is this really what I want to do? It's almost as if she understands that she's not going to be the same after she goes through this, or she doesn't quite understand what is involved with them developing a cure from her. And like, Joel kind of picks up on it and says like, look, we don't even have to do this at all. But then
Was
you can
that?
see that Ellie has now the resolve to push through it.
I don't think that was it. I feel like it was
No,
after she
right
gets.
before the giraffe moment.
No, I feel like it was after she gets kidnapped, or abducted by the cannibals.
Yeah, well,
And
that is like right after it.
Yeah.
okay, so it's after her experience with the cannibals, and
Oh, well, I
that's
guess
what.
yeah, absolutely. I guess that's just a different interpretation that we had. I thought she
Yeah.
was more concerned about like what lies ahead,
To be
which is kind
fair,
of
if I
dumb
just
because like
spent
she
the
literally almost just
winter,
got raped. So.
yeah, the winter with rapist cannibals, I'd probably be more concerned about that. But and that was the other thing, is that it showed this huge juxtaposition of, Joel was the grim, crouchy old guy the whole time who barely reacted with any emotion whatsoever, and Ellie was always trying to get his spirits up. And now it's like fully switches in this scene where, this is the first time Joel's been with her properly since they were separated, since he got the rebar to the stomach. And it's like
The
he's
great rebarring.
and it's like he's fully accepted her as a daughter, almost too far in one direction, right? Where he's gone a bit overboard, but he's super giddy and he's happy, and he's like, let's go on this adventure. Let's like everything's
Yeah.
great now. Everything's back to normal. But now she's the grim one.
Yeah, Ellie hardly said a thing, and Joel was like continually bringing
Yeah.
things up and like, oh, you know what? When we get back, I'm going to teach you how to play guitar. You listen? And she goes, oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you say, it's juxtaposed very heavily to the rest of the game.
Well, and this game just shows such satisfying character development. It's so gradual and so by the end so deserved. You feel like you've gone through all these hurdles with Ellie, and at the start, Joel is he doesn't want anything to do with her. He's like at every turn, like Tess, leave her behind. This isn't worth anything. To these scenes that you're describing, where he's found a new daughter in her, really. And it's wonderful to watch, wonderful to see it unfold in that way.
After another great moment where, like back at the power plant, he tries to ditch Ellie again because he doesn't want the same thing happening again. He doesn't want to lose his second daughter, essentially, right? He doesn't want the same thing happening again. He sees himself as not fit to be a father figure at this point.
Well, he doesn't want to become attached, right?
Yeah, that too. Well, exactly. That's the whole. That's part of the meaning, right? Is you can't experience loss if you constantly distance yourself from everything,
Yeah.
and that's clearly an emotion that Joel has constantly struggled with, especially like you can even see is within his relationships with other people, like Tess, right?
Yeah. And even when he meets Sam and the other guy, it's he doesn't want to get close to them, and he warns Ellie about getting close to them because in his mind something terrible is going to happen, and then she's going to feel awful. Which he was right, but
For different reasons. I thought Joel was more trying to be more protective, like just doesn't. Joel's like just can't trust anybody, right?
To me, it just felt like don't get attached to these people. This world sucks, and nothing good will come of it. Like you will feel worse for being attached to these people when something happens.
Yeah, it's a very cynical and I guess product of
Watching your
a
daughter
product
die
of
in
the
your
time that
arms.
they've lived in. Yeah, exactly. And by living 20 years in this, nightmare, really.
Well, speaking of that, actually, and his daughter, I wanted to say that the opening segment of this game is probably one of the most gripping and effective opening segments that I've played in a game, where I was almost immediately attached to these characters. And it's not a particularly deep segment in terms of gameplay. I mean, you run, hit square a few times, and watch some cutscenes. But in terms of telling a story and introducing you to characters and letting you become attached to them, I think it's a perfect example of this. And I think the way it does this is by starting you off playing Sarah, Joel's daughter, because you aren't experiencing the entire opening segment as Joel and witnessing this from sort of a secondhand perspective, witnessing his daughter from a secondhand perspective. You are her. And when she wakes up in the middle of the night and he's not there, you're playing through her fear and her concern and her confusion and what she's witnessing. And it's this young girl, and you're wandering around looking for your father, and there's the news segment and the explosions, and then you see the first infected, and your father kills them, and you're still experiencing Joel's story to an extent, but you're becoming more and more engrossed in Sarah's story. So by the
Yes,
time
through a different lens.
so by the time you are in the car accident and the perspective switches to Joel, you've become attached to his daughter. You've become attached to Sarah, and you're concerned for what's going to happen to her. So when the segment ends with her dying, you don't expect that. You were just playing her. The main character doesn't die. You've been playing her for half as long as this game's been running so far. So it's sort of a punch in the gut where you're sad because this character you've connected to through gameplay is dead. And you're sad because you've witnessed her relationship with her father, and you're seeing his reaction to it as well.
I think the opening is also made very strong by the use of environmental storytelling throughout. And again, this is repeated throughout the rest of the game, but I feel like in the beginning, kind of the tales of a broken home kind of really hit home through the environmental storytelling in that area, where it doesn't strap you into the Ludovico machine and say, this is what the story is, right? It kind of allows you to look around and kind of understand what this life is like for her through the environment of her home.
Yeah, those are all great points. Another thing that I think that is really good about the opening bit is how it shows Sarah and Joel pre-apocalypse, emergency situation, you know,
before
like
everything goes down.
Joel just comes home. Yeah, he just comes home from work. Like, you know, they have a bit of witty repartee. She says she sells hardcore drugs, and you know, immediately it's you know, it's fun, it's cute, and
Like
you're
these
already
characters, they're friendly and nice. But in terms of what Cam was saying, actually, in being allowed to explore this environment as Sarah, the other thing is, you know, in a lot of games, they don't limit your movement for obvious reasons, because, you know, you don't want the player to feel limited, because players are touchy in terms of that often. But in this game, you start as Sarah, right? And you get up, and after this smooth blend from a cutscene, you push all the way on the stick, and she's walking very timidly. You know, you're running through the environment trying to find daddy and look at everything. You know, you're scared, and you're sort of slowly walking around. And I feel like that adds to the immersion of the story, because if you juxtapose this intense narrative story, like track, with this character sprinting around their bedroom and then sprinting down the hall and running into their father's room after banging into the wall because they ran too fast.
Yeah,
and, you know,
running into the wall for a couple seconds. And
yeah, it really takes you out of that experience. So being limited in that aspect is incredibly effective. It puts you more in the shoes of this character.
well, the story's only believable if the characters act like the story's real, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's definitely good that they do that. They slow you down, but there are parts about that opening part where you first take control of Sarah that highlight, for me, issues with having these kind of segments in video games where you have to walk slowly towards a goal that the character is trying to get to. Because the first thing that I did when I got control of Sarah was walk around her room and look at all the stuff in her room. But, you know, Sarah waking up in the middle of the night would just walk out the door and go look for her dad. So there's a bit of dissonance there in when they give you that control.
So basically, when you treat it as a game and abuse that control,
dare I
it
treat
ruins
this
the
like a game? Well, as a game designer, you always have to you always have to imagine what happens if the player decides to do this instead of what I want them to do, right?
True. I think the thing is in a narrative game, or a narrative-driven game like this one, you have to trust that the story beats so far will drive the player emotionally to do the thing you would expect them to do. So, you know, these things are happening. Sarah's confused. She gets up. She's going to go look for her dad, not look at all the cool things she's picked up in her room so far, which is, you know, it's
Well, certainly that's what she would do.
Yeah, but for
right.
me as a gamer, that's against everything I've ever known and believed in. So
So that's the thing. They have to convince the 25-year-old man playing this 13-year-old girl that she isn't going to instantly look for her father. She's going to look for collectibles or something. And the only way they can do that is through this emotional connection that they've
I'm gonna
tried to
take a quick
establish.
pop into my diary here.
Yeah.
Certainly. Well, there's a segment much later in the game when the great rebarring happens, and you know, Joel gets up off the rebar, and this is definitely a huge trope in video games now. But you have your character wounded, walking slowly
You're kind of
towards.
you have your
Yeah, like
bleed out
limping.
time.
Like you have a hole
Yeah,
in your
limping.
gut, and you can't really run around all that much.
Yeah. And in that situation, I guess I didn't try. Well, here's the thing. I didn't even try to explore the room while Joel had a rebar-sized hole through him because
Understandably, yeah.
I was connected to the moment of what was going on there
Yeah.
and invested personally in seeing him survive.
Also, watching the way Ellie was reacting to it was phenomenal. The way she was, I mean, some of it was a little odd. She was kind of like, "Ah, you're fine." Well, I don't know. She's obviously concerned. Just like it didn't work out perfectly for me, but I really enjoyed how she realized that like she kind of needs to step up in this instance, and she's actually genuinely concerned that Joel's hurt. And I think that as well kind of takes away from the fact that holding forward and watching Joel limp around isn't very much fun. But watching it happen with like Ellie to support you is great. It's phenomenal. It's a great moment.
It- it's not fun, but it is engaging.
Hmm.
Well, it's the same thing. Like if we go back to the beginning, it's not exactly like the most. It's not the most fun part of the game. And honestly, when I came into this game for the first time, and I wasn't even playing it for the podcast, I was playing it because I was like, okay, I'll get around. I'll play this game. It honestly, like, it was a little slow moving for me. I wasn't really into it right away. So I mean, it is effective. It is a good opening, but again, it can be a little slow moving when you're not already invested into it.
But I mean, are you going into it with, what mindset have you gone into this game with, that you're experiencing a narrative game, or that you just want to get to the game, like you just want to start blowing heads off and
Well, no, I went
shaking
think it's a
clickers?
narrative game. That's why like there's a lot of environmental storytelling around. It felt like I enjoyed the environmental storytelling because it kind of gave like a ground, like a foundation to the story, to the world that we live in. But at the same time, it didn't serve to progress anything, right? It felt like I was kind of doing like a reading before getting into it, right? It felt like I had to know all the backstory and the lore, right? It kind of felt like I have to do this before the game progresses, or else I'm not going to enjoy it as much.
But the thing is, would you? I mean, would you care
I don't
about
know. I didn't.
Joel? True, but would you care about Joel as much theoretically if you didn't experience this segment of storytelling, this loss at the beginning personally? If you just, in a conversation with Tess, there was just some exposition about how Tess is like, "Oh, Joel, you gotta forget about the loss of your daughter. Like, she's gone. You just gotta move on." And Joel's like, "I can't move on. She died in my arms." Like,
Well, that's not what I'm arguing.
yeah.
That's not what I'm arguing. I'm not saying that it's not a good moment and that the loss of his daughter isn't striking. I'm saying that like wandering around the house, like reading notes and things is it's good backstory. But as far as like the first moments in the game where you step in, it kind of all it does is kind of slow down the pacing, right? It feels like right away, like, okay, I'm in a game. Like right away. Like you say, like there are some great narrative moments to the game, but right as you drop in, unless you do exactly what you think Sarah would do, which I'm not programmed to do. I'm searching around the house, right? It feels like a game right off the bat. And it kind of feels like that like some of those moments and some of the environmental storytelling, as strong as they are, shouldn't be the first thing you encounter in the game.
So by that logic, then, would you say they would have been better to make that entire segment a cutscene until she finds her father, and then everything moves on, and you don't gain control until Joel? Because
No, I think it should be. I think there should be still the environmental storytelling. I think more of it should be through like quickly recognizable items within the house, and then a linear progression through to like text documents that if you want to, you can skip. Like Sarah, go find something, pick it up, put it back down, and then quickly progress the other thing. So it's not so much I'm looking around for things. I have to spend time to actively avoid progressing the story right off the bat to find lore things that I'm not going to be able to see unless I do it right now. And kind of they put it within your path a little bit more.
but
I'm not saying it's a
were
bad
there?
moment. I just think it could have paced a little better.
I mean, in my experience, I didn't have that. So, were there actually, collectibles or unique objects that you could interact with throughout that,
Yeah,
or?
Oh,
there were
absolutely.
text notes and stuff like that that you had
Oh,
to like you
well,
had to go first off you have to find them, and that's my point. It's like they're not right in your face. You have to kind of go off the path to find them, take the time to read them, put it down, maybe find a couple more, and then go back to the story.
so then theoretically, the problem is that the developers rewarded that, that the way you went about that. They didn't say there's nothing for you here, keep going. It's they rewarded your exploration there.
I think it's fine as it is. I just don't think it serves very well as an opening act. I think the opening act is strong, but
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that it does make some amount of sense that Sarah would be looking around the house for for where Joel is or clues to where she is or he is, because you find like his phone and find like a note on the fridge where he says like he won't be home till later. So it makes some amount of sense that she would want to look around, just not her own room.
Yeah, it's like, Dad, are you under the bed? Like, what's going on here? But yeah, and like I found the phone, and that's a very obvious one that players are likely going to find, just because it's it's making noise, it's lighting up, and it's in that final area of the house where you are going to find your dad at some like in the next 20 seconds. And I guess the thing is, to me, that like I said, the thought didn't cross my mind to do that. For me, I got into those shoes and I was looking for her father, or for my father in this situation, I guess. It's like, I guess I was lucky in that sense that I didn't get, I didn't kick in that gamer mindset of look around for clues and collectibles. And in that regard, I don't know how they would have done that otherwise, where how do you convince the player without blatantly saying, quick, go find your dad, if the player has been groomed to think that they need to look around for clues and objects.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough, as we've discussed here, it's a tough balance. Like, I mean, when you first gain control of your character in any video game, the first thing you're going to do is, move around, test the button, see what you can do. And that was definitely my experience here.
Yeah, so I mean, overall, I think for me at least, this was it maybe 15-minute opening segment was effective way for me to grow more attached to Joel and his motivations and his character. So for me at least, it worked.
Oh, I think it still worked for me. I just think it could have been done slightly better.
Well, to move on from that, I feel like a game like this that has such a huge focus on narrative, in order for it to be a good game, a good experience, the narrative needs to be satisfying. It needs to be of high quality. All right, like that seems pretty obvious, right?
Sure.
Because failing that, you've failed to, I guess, deliver on the promise that the experience offers if the narrative is not satisfying. And by all means, I think this game has phenomenal narrative, super satisfying. And to contrast it with Red Dead Redemption 2, this is a game that I feel has failed on this promise. I know you haven't finished it, Evan, but it's a game that I feel ultimately drops the ball narratively when it has such a strong focus on the narrative. Believe me, it's a big part of Red Dead 2, but it is a little empty, is all I'll say. And by the end, the game feels ultimately unsatisfying for me as a result.
Well, we've talked before about how I enjoy Red Dead for what I've played so far, and like you said, I haven't finished it yet. But to me, Red Dead is now stay with me on this one. It's akin to Animal
Hot
Crossing
take
to me.
incoming. Oh god, hot
Red
take.
Dead 2 is Animal Crossing.
The spiritual
So-
successor.
So what I
Except you
mean
can
by
eat your
that,
neighbors instead.
what I mean by that is, when I was playing Red Dead 2, I was relaxed. I'm out there exploring the world, doing things slowly and very particularly, which to me felt like how the game was designed. So I didn't interact necessarily with the narrative drive of the game. I was happy to go out there and live my cowboy sim life. So, I mean, now that you mention, now that you're comparing it to The Last of Us, given that option in The Last of Us, I don't know how well it would have gone. It's a very structured and focused story, and that's what's driving the game. If in The Last of Us I'm allowed to, piss off and explore skyscrapers for 10 hours at a time and find side quests and grow a beard, lose some weight, change my outfit, buy some stuff at the store, you're right, it probably would not have been an effective game because the focus on that narrative would have been gone.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's because Red Dead 2 tries to do it all. It tries to be heavily narrative focused, and it tries to be a large open world, almost sim game, like you say. And the problem is that it's so
It's trying to be everything, jack of all trades. It's so unfocused, it isn't successful at either. In terms of that, Red Dead has its own discussion to be had about how successful it was in terms of being a narrative driven game versus a gameplay driven game. But in terms of The Last of Us, I think it does that successfully. And as much as the gameplay itself might be a bit more shallow than other, contemporary games, it is very focused on the narrative drive. And I think that's what makes people consider it such an incredible game because it's focused, and despite maybe alienating people who would have wanted a more open game, it did what it was trying to do almost perfectly.
Man, there's plenty of other sandboxes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll go play Minecraft. That's got zombies and stuff. Same game.
It's practically the same game.
So with that, I mean, part of the reason the narrative works so well is the immersion with this world and the story. And obviously, a big part of that is the presentation of the game. I mean, how's the art style? What's the detail? What's the ambient sort of feeling of the game? The sound, the atmosphere, the music, the different character designs. And I think that in almost all of these categories, it is massively successful, which is part of why I think it adds to that overall narrative immersion and what makes that so successful. And I know that a lot of people have talked about this, but in particular, the music. Gustavo did some good stuff with this game, I think. I mean, those
My
guitar
man went for
tracks,
gold.
those guitar tracks are so thematically perfect for this story and this environment that I couldn't imagine a generic or a typical video game OST going with it, as opposed to this more unique guitar tracks.
Well, yeah, it's very subtle, understated, and the kind of acoustic sound to it makes it sound more rugged.
Well, it's almost lonely, and
It's very well tailored. It definitely fits the mood more often than it doesn't.
yeah, and it almost adds to the character where, like you were saying earlier, Joel's telling Ellie when he's getting all excited that he's going to teach her how to play guitar later, and it's this personal connection between them where it's a very intimate song, and it the sort of main theme of the game, and him being able to teach her this is a very intimate experience. And I feel like that theme is very well integrated into the music of the game.
In a way, it's almost, this is just a thought I kind of had on the spot, but like Joe used to be a singer, right? He used to want to be a musician by trade, right? And then the music of the game is sort of, he's accompanied by kind of what he wanted to do the whole time, right? You can almost
That's a
think
good
that
point.
that's what's playing in his head almost, or what he would
Yeah.
like to experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely feels very fitting for Joel as a character. He's a very rugged, very American middle-aged guy from Texas, and the acoustic sound, like the acoustic guitar, absolutely fits that image very nicely.
Yeah, so in terms of the presentation itself and the visual presentation, it's almost amazing how well the game holds up even to this day. I mean, there's obviously a clear lack of graphical fidelity in a few instances, but overall, I mean, the style and the lighting and the artistic flair involved in a lot of the characters design is almost timeless.
I think it does a really good job of not making everything just a brown, gray, ugly mess, right? Like there's some really good lighting in the area, like you said, that kind of makes some of the areas pop and some of them feel like dank and dark, right? And kind of scary, especially when you enter areas with spores and you put like Joel puts the mask on, obviously, and it's kind of like it really feels like you're surrounded by,
Yeah, it's like
pollen
almost
that's gonna
claustrophobic.
make your
It's
allergies turn you into a zombie. But
yeah.
yeah, it's absolutely claustrophobic. It plays in really well to
Yeah, did anyone ever try giving the infected Claritin?
it. I mean, a little human compassion here, people. Honestly,
Yeah, and I mean the art direction for the world and it is a very interesting look at urban decay. You know, like over like 20 years of these neglected cityscapes. You have like destroyed freeways and flooded subways and you know skyscrapers falling apart and I don't even know how that one at the start is leaning against the other, but it's cool, so I'll allow it. But
physics, baby.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting how they show the desolation and despair that's really been caused by this outbreak over this period of time.
I really enjoy the whole, nature trying to reclaim the city aspect. I think that's a really beautiful and beautiful contrast they use in some of those areas. Like when you're walking through the freeway and there's like grass growing on the freeway, or the cars are kind of, growing mold through everything.
That's true, but it's also a fairly common trope, I guess you could say. I don't want to say trope, but a lot of these post-apocalyptic stories do involve that sort of nature reclaiming the urban environment thing, which, obviously it's done because it's fairly effective and it's a huge juxtaposition to what we are accustomed to in real life. I think the most effective thing for me, actually, in terms of that dystopian, almost post-apocalyptic society that the game portrays, is that, the safe zones where it's not the nature reclaiming, but the power struggle between people who have survived and who have this authority to dictate how the society is going to run. So obviously Joel himself is the smuggler and Tess as well, and you interact with, most of the people you interact with in the second act of the opening there are also smugglers. It's people outside the law, and it's this sort of depiction of society where general law and order has been lost and everyone's trying to survive however they can underneath this almost oppressive military control. I mean, it's a miracle any of them even wear masks at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's something they also don't, I guess, go into too much about the, I guess, military and the what's left of the government regime. And I mean, it's not super important to the telling of the story. So,
Yeah,
but we don't really see a lot of outside of the first act, a lot of what life is like at this point for the average person. But it's not necessarily a problem.
yeah. No, I just think it's an interesting little world building thing they added to it.
One of my favorite parts of the presentation actually is actually just some of the idle animations. Ellie has some really interesting idle animations, especially when she's frustrated with Joel. She kind of like walks around sulking and kind of like kicking around on the dirt. And it's really cool to not only hear it through like the character development through voice lines, but it really shows just through an idle animation, right? Where she'll like go maybe sit down and kind of kick her legs a bit and be totally, you know, not paying attention to the situation that's going on. It really helped cement her as a serious character, right? Where she doesn't just well, I mean in combat obviously she just like flies around bumping into zombies willy-nilly. But like through the other times she acts and behaves like you would expect to a 14-year-old, right?
A real person would behave. Yeah, it's not just when you're interacting with them specifically.
Yeah, they do a good job of making the world feel alive in that way, and they don't really waste. They don't waste those moments where they can show you that, and further to that, they don't waste a lot of time while you're just walking around, like from point A to point B. Usually, they have some sort of interaction between Joel and Ellie or whoever else is with you to kind of fill that time.
It's true. I mean, it's a very, for the most part, a very densely packed experience. There's not much pure downtime where nothing at all is happening. It's you're either in some kind of encounter, some kind of puzzle, environmental puzzle, or some kind of character experience. And you're right, Cam, they do take great use of all their available sort of assets. I mean, it's not just cutscenes and audio, but visuals. It's this AI character walking around while you are doing your own thing, but they're acting like a believable person.
Yeah, it's things like that where they affect even the mannerisms of the way characters interact that really adds a specific level of detail to the actual characters themselves that really bring them to life.
All right, well, I think with that, we will move on to our final segment, which is the all-important question bonus round. Start off with Evan here, and do you think that, we've been talking about how this game, or at least I was, about how this game is kind of simple in its gameplay, like its basic gameplay loops. And so do you think that this game should have tried to have more variety in what the player is actually doing?
I think it's a very steep slope in good ways and bad ways in that regard. I think that if they had allocated more time and effort to increasing unique situations and unique interactions in terms of gameplay, that it may have taken away from their vision of what they wanted to tell, the story they wanted to tell. And by all means, I don't think that the way the game exists currently is inherently flawed. Leaning on shallow, yes, but not bad. The gameplay itself is a means to the end of this narrative. And for me at least, I think that it was effective. I think that it engaged me when it needed to. And I don't think that I think there would have been diminishing returns after a certain point of adding unique interactions or more varied interaction in gameplay.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, adding gameplay loops or different variety of the scenarios you're in would, make the game more enjoyable in the moment to moment and make the gamey parts of the game like more fun. But as you say, on the other hand, that would detract from their vision ultimately, which I think was the most important thing on a game like this. And like we've been saying, it's a very thin line to walk. Is how much gameplay do we put in when we're trying to tell this story? And if you think that one end of the spectrum is like a walking simulator, like What Remains of Edith Finch, and the other end is Tetris, then Last of Us is I guess closer to the walking simulator in that way, but not
For
in a
sure.
bad way.
Yeah.
And so Cam, what do you think sets this game apart from its contemporaries, like similar games? Like, what do you think attributed to the game's widespread appeal?
Zombies. Bitches love zombies. No,
That's right.
actually,
Okay, moving on.
moving right along. What I actually think really helped move this game to like the forefront of what people really think to be kind of a era-defining game in terms of narrative storytelling is the quality of the characters, like we've touched on. And I kind of wanted to bring up Uncharted for an example. Uncharted always like the characters in Uncharted, especially like the second and third game, are really strong characters, and they're voiced particularly well too. It's just the story structure that they try to fit them into doesn't work very well, and they're constantly pulling and shoving in other characters that it's doesn't help the narrative very well. I think that Uncharted, or sorry, The Last of Us rather, the pacing of the game allows for a like for these characters to express themselves. It allows for a slower paced and like more methodical approach to storytelling where we truly get to see, what the characters are feeling and truly try to empathize with them. I think that having Naughty Dog being behind the reins, right? It kind of, you assume that because they've done a similar style of gameplay a couple of times that, the gameplay is going to be solid. It wasn't, like we said, it's not anything special, but you've got a solid core game behind it, and they were allowed to take the same kind of strong character construction they have and go even further with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was one of the first games to deliver a narrative experience of such a high quality and in such an immersive way. And I think for that, is absolutely something that is worth talking about and worth playing. And so maybe why don't we say our closing bits about this one, if you want to start us off, Evan.
Yeah, I mean, this game I probably, won't go back to play again. Not for the near future, at least. But at the not even at the least, I enjoyed the hell out of this game, and I don't regret that. I probably won't go back to it anytime soon. I think it did everything it needed to in my first playthrough, and I think for that it deserves the credit it's gotten so far.
Fair enough. I probably could be along sort of the same lines. I do enjoy the game. I think it's a good game. I think maybe if you turned it more towards a walking simulator, I found that the parts that really had me enthralled and really enjoying the game were the character development bits. And while like the bits in between were okay, they were serviceable bits of gameplay. I feel like if even if there were less of them and it turned more towards a walking simulator, we got to explore these characters even deeper. It would have been even better for me. Because like you say, I probably won't come back to this game. But there are times games like this that I will come back to. Like for example, like I don't know if you mentioned it, but God of War like had a good story, but it's got like the great gameplay too. That like again, it's a little bit longer, lengthier, but I'd go back and play that for the story and for the set pieces, and because the game's actually fun itself. Whereas this game, you're right. I think that well, maybe if it was a walking simulator, I'd come and experience it again. But there's just too much of the gameplay in between that I don't really enjoy very much. That kind of keeps me from coming back for more.
Fair enough. I mean, for me personally, I think it took a while for this game to, I guess, kind of for me to appreciate it as much as I do now. But I've definitely come around to it. I think, to be the 100th time you hear the word narrative today, but it definitely has one of the strongest narratives in video gaming, even to date, I think. I mean, I haven't played part two, so we'll see what that's like. But I think for that alone, it's worth playing and it's worth experiencing. So I think we'll end off there. We can tune in next episode for a discussion about the highly popular video game Minecraft. Thanks for listening. This is GameDive. Hey everyone, this is Perry. Thanks for listening to GameDive. Make sure to join in on the discussion below and let us know what your thoughts are about the game. And if you enjoyed the discussion, you can drop us a like. GameDive is a bi-weekly podcast, so be sure to subscribe and check back every other Tuesday for a brand new episode.